Good afternoon. I'm Jared Ball, Chief Economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Welcome to CEDA's Economic Implications of COVID-19 livestream. Today, we're going to be discussing how the crisis is reshaping the global macroeconomic outlook, how that translates into the Australian domestic outlook, and what the impact of recent government fiscal packages will be over the short and long term. I'd really like to thank our live stream sponsor today, HS, at a pivotal time for the economy. At this time of significant economic uncertainty, CEDA remains true to its purpose in providing platforms to advance and promote debate on critical issues. And that's why we're doing this live stream today. Over coming months, we'll be making a number of events available across different digital formats to ensure that CEDA members and the community more broadly can access discussion on the most important issues impacting economic and social development. As details of these events are confirmed, they'll be made available on the CEDA website, ceda.com.au, and I encourage you to check the website for those details. We've also been producing regular podcasts and video interviews with leading experts and policymakers to ensure that you can remain informed with quality information on the issues impacting the economy and also impacting key sectors such as health and resources. Today, like at all our public events, you'll still be able to interact with the speakers through our Q&A portal Pigeonhole, which is available via the link on your screen. Click the link and you can add questions for our speakers, which will then be provided to me as facilitator for today's discussion. The passcode is implication, all capitals. Importantly, CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. We're committed to recognition and reconciliation, and we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. Now, just a couple of months ago, we held our economic and political overview events across the country. And when we heard from economists at these events, they often summed up 2019 looking back in one word: uncertainty. Well, we're just 4 months into 2020, and I think we're all running out of adjectives and for that matter, nouns to describe what's happening this year. Making sense of the economic dimensions of COVID-19 is keeping economists on their toes, as events outrun the official lines of data that we have, and also just grappling with the likely future path of this pandemic across the globe. Luckily today, we've got an absolutely cracking lineup of economists for you who are all well known, I think, for making sense of the trends that are shaping our economy. I'd like to extend a warm but physically distant welcome to our speakers today. We have Paul Bloxham, Chief Economist, Australia, New Zealand and Global Commodities at HSBC. Sarah Hunter, who's the Chief Economist at BIS Oxford Economics, and Nikki Hutley, the partner at Deloitte Access Economics. I'm sure they will be well known to many of you. Their bios are on the website if you want further details. We're going to hear from each of them over the course of the next 35 minutes, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So I encourage you to get your questions ready and onto the porthole as the speakers are going through their presentations. So now I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Paul Bloxham.
Well, thanks very much, Jared, and thanks everyone else for joining. I've got the next 15 minutes to give you an overview of what's been going on recently and some views as to how things are playing out. So I'm going to get straight to it. As you would all be very well aware, this shock is unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like this. We've seen things that you can draw some lessons from, like the SARS event that happened back in 2003, and potentially the Spanish flu epidemic that happened back in 1919. But the global economy is so much more interconnected now than it was. And of course, in that post-war period, there were very, very big differences between what's happened now and what's happened then. So there is a great deal of uncertainty. And with that in mind, I mean, I've been spending a lot of time doing a lot of these sorts of presentations and making it clear that what economists can contribute right now is to give a set of scenarios and probabilities and likely outcomes, but point estimates, forecasts that actually point out this is a particular number we really think is going to happen in the short run or in the medium term, those are much harder. And there's so much uncertainty around them. I find it much more useful to think in broad themes, think in risks think about scenarios and so on. I want to give you a short sort of précis of how this thing's happened, and it is unprecedented, as I say, in both its scale and its scope, but also its speed in terms of the way things have developed. But I want to give you the short précis of the global story, then a little bit of a view on what's going to how we think things are playing out in terms of the risks to the global story. A brief mention of domestic, and then I'm going to hand to Sarah to talk more about the domestic outlook and the domestic story. As you know, this thing arrived this year. 20th of January was about when it really became a global market event. It started off in China. Back then, the market was treating it as though it was just a China story. It was in Hubei province in Wuhan. The Chinese authorities moved very, very rapidly. And back then, we were referring to what they were doing in terms of their policy as draconian. They were shutting down Wuhan and Hubei and trying to contain the outbreak. If you look back at what they did, you're able to say they did provide containment. They are going to see a sharp contraction in economic activity. It's already happened in the first quarter. But we are seeing that having contained it, they're being able to put their economy back to work. And so most of the indicators are showing an upward trend. Some of the indicators, like industrial production, are back at operating at maybe 90% capacity. So China has gone through this episode, managed to contain it, and we are on some sort of recovery path from China. Now, as I say, back at that period of time, the market was treating this as though it was just an Asian event, just a Chinese event. It wasn't going to necessarily make it to Western markets. That changed pretty rapidly. Around mid-February, it moved more rapidly into Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. They, of course, had the experience from the SARS event to learn from, so they responded quite differently. And then it arrived in late February, about the 21st of February, in northern Italy. And at that point, the story really changed. It became a Western story because it moved very, very quickly through Italy. They had to shut down Italy quite quickly, as you will recall. It moved into France, it moved into Spain, it became a British story, and it's become a global story since then. I don't need to go through that in a lot of detail. On the 16th of March, a paper came out. An epidemiologist from Imperial College London, Neil Ferguson, published this paper that was quite view-changing in terms of the way policymakers had to think about this, particularly for the UK, but it fed into US policy as well. This paper set out sort of three key points. One was, if all they did, the British were to do, was to deliver mitigation, that is sort of separating certain groups and trying to slow down the pace of the spread of COVID-19, it was going to overwhelm their health system, and it was going to overwhelm it quite quickly. So what it recommended was suppression, which is what, of course, policy has moved towards across the world, and containment to try to stop the spread of this virus. Now, I've been describing the policy choices that policymakers have faced as diabolical. This is a diabolical policy choice for policymakers. They've had to choose to deliver containment, knowing full well that in delivering that containment, they're also delivering an economic crisis. They're delivering an economic downturn, a very large economic downturn. It is very clear now from the range of statistics we can track that this will be a larger downturn than we've seen globally during the global financial crisis, which places it in the realms of being the largest downturn in the post-war period, and perhaps the largest since the Great Depression. And we're still only following the data down rather than knowing when they're going to start to turn around. Clearly, the objective is to try to make sure health systems are not overwhelmed. This paper that I referred to on the 16th of March said suppression was required rather than mitigation, and that's what governments have had to deliver across the world. There was one other point in that paper that was really, really telling, and one that we're all dealing with now as we think about the end game and the outward path. And that was, this paper also set out that if you suppressed, once you lifted those suppression measures, there was a really good chance that actually you'd get a second wave of an outbreak. Until there's a vaccine found, the paper said, actually, you wouldn't just get a downturn. Once you started to lift the containment measures, you might get a second wave. And that's where it all gets really quite complex. China is managing to be on a recovery path, but they have got quite a lot of containment in place to make sure that the virus doesn't have a second wave. Obviously, the Western economies are still dealing with the upswing rather than having peaked as yet, so we're still yet to see how that all plays out, and we don't know when that's going to peak. There's a great deal of uncertainty, as Jared said, because if you think about the sort of things that have to happen, firstly, you have to work out when the virus is going to peak. Secondly, you have to work out, once it's peaked, how quickly the containment measures will be released. Then you have to have some perspective on, once the containment measures are released, will you get a second wave of this? And will that mean that actually you still have to deliver more containment down the track? Will households respond if governments do release the containment measures and allow people to move more freely? Will they actually respond, or will they still be fearful? How will this play out? So our team has put together some forecasts and numbers, and much like others, we're forecasting a very sharp contraction in global GDP in the second quarter of this year. The numbers for the US, for example, they're suggesting that they think that GDP in the second quarter will fall by 12 or 13% just in the quarter. The European numbers are very similar. China, as I say, is on some sort of upward recovery path already. We get a first quarter print at the end of this week, a very sharp decline expected, followed by some sort of recovery. The team has in mind that hopefully we will be able to contain this and things will start to head back to normal and we'll get some sort of a V-shaped recovery. But I think there is a really considerable risk that actually this thing becomes a more elongated story. Now, while delivering those containment measures, authorities around the world, governments around the world have therefore had to provide support for their economies. And to do that, they've used the monetary and fiscal tools, and they've used them in great quantity. I mean, central banks around the world have cut interest rates, they're buying bonds, they're doing quantitative easing. Some central banks have moved on to buying actual private sector assets rather than just buying a public debt. And in addition to that, of course, that's provided an ability for governments around the world to deliver very large fiscal stimuluses. The short version is, in Europe, you've had less. In US, you've had quite a large fiscal stimulus. They've delivered a $2.2 trillion stimulus, 10% of GDP. But keep in mind, even though that's an enormous amount of money, you would think, and as a share of the economy, as I say, our US economist is expecting GDP to contract by a full 12 percentage points just in the second quarter. So despite the enormous amount of stimulus that's being delivered, it's still the case that the global economy is going to be very hard hit. The unemployment rates around the world are going to rise, activity is going to weaken, and the question still remains as to when it's going to start to pick up. Now, for Australia, one of the key things, of course, is how China's travelling. The fact that China is back on some sort of recovery path is very helpful for us. The fact that China is going to probably continue to pull the levers domestically and support its economy with infrastructure investment, that's continuing to provide support for metals prices, for example, iron ore and coal and base metals. And so that sector of Australia's got some support. But of course, this thing has arrived in Australia. You're all aware, you're all at home at the moment. These containment measures have arrived, and they are going to deliver a very sharp contraction to Australia's GDP in the second quarter as well. The rule of thumb that the basic numbers that I've been working with is if you add together recreation, hospitality, and services exports, that's 14% of Australia's GDP. So pick your number as to how much those things are going to contract, but they're going to be a huge drag on Australia's economy in the second quarter. Of course, we've seen very large stimulus delivered here. I'm not going to go through the details of that. Nikki's going to do that. But it's of the order of a bit over 10% of GDP just in spending measures to provide support for the economy. But we too are going to see a contraction in GDP and then a pickup in the unemployment rate. A couple of broader thoughts that I want to deliver just before I hand over to Sarah. And so one of the ways we've been thinking about this from Australia's perspective is that we have some benefits and some costs of being a distant island. We can control our borders. And so one of the benefits Australia may have is that we've blocked the borders, so we're not getting it in from offshore anymore. And if we can deliver enough containment to essentially get close to eliminating, or certainly controlling the spread of COVID-19, we can start to head our economy back to some sort of normal, even if it turns out that the global recovery is sluggish, that a vaccine doesn't arrive for quite some time. We can support our domestic economy that way. However, the challenge, of course, is that a lot of our economy has been dependent, and growth has been dependent in recent years on the international connections, the people connections, tourism, education. But you step one step further and look at the migration flows and how much that's contributed to Australia's GDP. And if you look at GDP, if you look at population growth for the last 5 years in Australia, it's been just under 2% per annum. Over 1%, almost 2/3 of that has come from inward migration. This is going to present a lot of challenges for our growth story if it turns out that migration stays weak for a considerable period of time. And then my final point, the one that I've been really sort of talking about a lot, is governments around the world are delivering these policies, and I think it makes a lot of sense, that are set to build a bridge between the pre-COVID world and the post-COVID world. The idea is try to put your economy into hibernation or cryostasis, if you like, freeze it, hold it ready to be able to revive when we're past the COVID-19 story. The challenge is that's good and that's an important thing to have delivered, but the post-COVID economy will probably look considerably different to the pre-COVID economy. And so making choices about which risks are socialized and how that's socialized is really important. And I can give you a few examples. One example would be simply the fact that we're all at home right now and working from our home offices rather than our work offices. It's highly likely that an extended period of this sort of activity will mean that businesses start to reconsider whether people really need to work in offices as much as they have done in the past. This could lead to a correction in office property values. Retail property is almost certainly going to change in terms of the way you think about retail spaces. People are buying more things online. Retailers have been trying to move towards that service orientation, people going to cinemas and activities and so on. That's probably going to stop for a period of time. Tourism is certainly going to change in all sorts of different ways. And we need to think about that in terms of which parts of the economy we're prepared to support with social policy and which with the public balance sheet and which bits we ought not to. And then finally, we're going to come out the end of this almost certainly with a higher unemployment rate than when we went into it. And of course, Australia carries around quite a lot of household debt. House prices are probably going to trend lower at full, and it's hard to know exactly how much, but with the slowdown of migration we're seeing, it seems highly likely that there are risks to the downside to the housing market. This combination of weaker commercial property, weaker house prices, and the household debt levels may very well test the financial stability of Australia as well. So there are various ways to think about the fact that the post-COVID world is going to potentially look quite different to the pre-COVID world. Finally, there is a point here that I think also needs to be raised about the broader outlook, and that is a lot of policy has been delivered very, very rapidly, and it is designed to provide support for the economy. When we start thinking about an exit strategy, though, we're going to have to start thinking about how it is some of these things are going to be unwound, whether this crisis is also an opportunity to have a more comprehensive economic reform agenda that actually supports the competitiveness and productivity growth in Australia. This is something we've needed anyway. Is this the opportunity for that to be delivered? And I think a lot of that will have to happen. That discussion will have to happen in the coming period, and it should be something that we all look to try to take some serious views on. I'm going to stop there. I know I've covered quite a lot in a relatively short period of time, but I've filled my 15 minutes. I'm going to hand over to Sarah, and hopefully look forward to taking some questions a bit later.
Thank you for that, Paul, and thank you for those comments. I'll pick up on a few of them. I was tasked with doing a bit more of a deep dive into the outlook for Australia, and I'm going to particularly focus my comments on the near term. I think Paul's absolutely right in saying that a lot of the questions that we now have around what the long term look like, how does the recovery trajectory progress, what are some of the structural shifts that we're likely to see. We could spend a lot of time talking about them. They're very big questions, but they're very, very unknown at the moment. And I think we can probably be a little bit, at least more concrete in terms of the ranking of the impact across sectors and across states, and also in terms of what we're likely to see in terms of the data as it plays out over the next few months. So just picking up a little bit on that international story and how that's going to feed through. So obviously net exports have been a major driver of the economy over the last couple of years. A lot of that has been around that services piece, so that's tourism and higher education. Clearly very challenging environment there, very, very challenging environment. We're going to see some very sharp falls in those the revenues for those sectors. We already know that from some of the data that's come out. So the overseas arrivals, for instance, in February, so this is pre-real tightening of the border, they were already down 12.5% month on month. So that was just the impact really of restricting arrivals from China. And international student arrivals in the same month, they were down 34% on the year. So that's a really substantial shock there, and that's in February. So that's before really a lot of the big dislocation is going to start showing up. But I think picking up on Paul's point about China and the fact that economy is now starting to get going, that is actually a positive for us, of course, in the current environment through commodities primarily. So we are seeing that industrial production in China is starting to return back towards what we might describe as more normal levels, electricity consumption as well. It's very slow, it's very steady speed of recovery, but it is happening. And so that should provide some support, or at least put a floor underneath where commodity demand is going to go for us. And so if we're looking at net exports overall, then they're likely to be very supportive for GDP through this year. So we're going to see some support coming through from the commodity side. Nothing very much on the services side, of course, but then our imports of services are also going to fall sharply. Put rather bluntly, we're not allowed to leave the country now. We're on a travel ban, so we're not going to be importing holidays from abroad. We're not going to be importing other services. And with the domestic demand shock that we're seeing, goods imports are also likely to fall very, very sharply. Retail spending is a lot lower. We know that, and I'll touch on that in just a second. But that shows up in terms of our goods imports. Investment is also likely to take a big hit in this environment. Businesses are going to feel very unwilling to invest. And so our intermediate and our capital goods imports are also going to fall back really sharply. So overall then, there is some support coming through the GDP from net exports. Not that it's anything to get too excited about, and that it's the wrong kind of support. It's a sign of severe weakness in our domestic economy, but it is, from an accounting perspective, a positive. So I'll leave that in terms of the one potential part of good news. In terms of the data that we're going to see, and pivot now more onto that domestic demand. So Paul actually sort of flagged that if we look at the, trying to measure the direct impact of the restrictions, if you look at those service sectors that have effectively been forced to stop producing, so social service sectors we've been trying to describe them as, so where we socially interact, restaurants, cafes, entertainment, sports, certain parts of retail, all of those sorts of things. If we just take the direct impact from that, as Paul mentioned, it's sort of maybe around 15% of GDP. We think, though, in terms of consumer spending, there's going to be an additional negative impact on top of that. We've also got to factor in that even if the shops are open, for example, with the exception of supermarkets, they're getting much less footfall, much less traffic coming through. We've also got to magnify on top of that the impact of the fall in income for those people that are working in the sectors that are most impacted, and even in sectors that are not directly impacted from reduced hours, perhaps people having to take wage deferrals or wage cuts. For those that have been furloughed, they're moving from their usual income to the JobKeeper payments. For those that have been made unemployed, they're moving to JobSeeker. And there are some examples where people actually end up being paid more on the JobSeeker than they would from their normal employment if they're casual, less than full-time, and earning something in the region of national minimum wage. They are very much the exception. The rule will be that the majority of people that are impacted by job cuts and hours and wage reductions are going to see lower household income, we think. So there's an additional negative impact on consumption there. We think it's going to be really substantial. We think that spending in the current quarter could fall by something like 25%. That's consumer spending. So that's and it's the biggest component of GDP. So that's a huge negative potentially coming through there. The other major indirect channel that we are very concerned about is investment, business investment. This is clearly not an environment that businesses want to invest in. And we think this is going to show up across the board. So some construction projects that we might have expected to get underway 3-6 months ago, we don't think those are going to get off the ground, some of them at least, particularly in some of the sectors that are most exposed, the tourism, retail, and other areas like that. I think it's also very, very likely that machinery and equipment investment will also take a hit. Again, this is not an environment that firms want to be investing in to expand the capacity in. It's so uncertain. We don't know what the recovery trajectory is going to look like. We don't really, at this point in time, have a clear idea of when recovery takes hold, what the unwinding timetable is for all of these restrictions. As Paul mentioned, what are some of those longer term implications? So if you're a business looking at investment right now, this is not an attractive environment. And we know that from some of the high frequency data that we're getting through the confidence indices. The NAB business survey came in at 65.6. That data was released earlier this year. Oh, sorry, it came in at the trough of the much worse than the trough of the GFC. So we know that these decisions are going to be delayed, that businesses are feeling the pinch and are struggling through this, of course, and that's going to be a further indirect negative on the economy. So if we put all of this together, then there's a lot of bad stuff going on right now, clearly, and it's a very challenging environment and it is very uncertain. But what does this mean across the sectors, and how is this going to play out? Well, I mean, I can tell you some rather obvious things for travel and sectors that are tied into tourism. So food and food services and accommodation, parts of retail, clearly it's very, very difficult. But we're also expecting to see quite a sharp downturn in terms of construction activity with the delay of those investment projects. We're also expecting that to feed through the construction pipeline. So a lot of professional services companies are also going to be exposed to this downturn in activity, although you wouldn't expect them to be directly impacted. And certainly in terms of being able to work, working from home may not be as efficient as being in the office, but it is certainly possible, as Paul mentioned, we're already doing it now. But that's not going to stop the drag on those particular sectors. I think it is also probably worth flagging some of the more resilient parts of the economy and where we are, potentially likely to see a recovery first and more pronounced than in others. One of the big pluses that goes with the net exports picture I was outlining earlier is around mining. So we do think that the mining sector will be relatively resilient. We know that they're not being particularly affected by the social distancing restrictions. In fact, the WA government in particular have put in place policies to allow that sector to continue to produce. And as I mentioned earlier on, the demand, certainly in terms of China, we think at the very least it's not going to fall anywhere near as sharply as other parts of the economy, and could potentially continue to grow as they implement stimulus policies to get their economy going. So there's some positive there. There's also potentially, again, relative to the rest of the economy, some resilience likely to come through in terms of agriculture, and some parts of the East Coast have now had some rain, a lot of rain through the autumn, late summer, autumn period, which will help with production there. And that will then feed through into food processing. And of course, in terms of consumption, a very basic need for all of us is that we eat and that we continue to consume output from that sector. So there's some resilience there as well that is likely to appear. I think that in terms of the relative positives, those are the few and far between. If we look across the other parts of the economy, though, as I said, it's very negative. And I think it is worth stressing, as Paul said at the start, this is a unique, unprecedented downturn. In terms of its size, yes, but in terms of also its makeup. Normally, in terms of when we look at business cycles and we see how they play out, they tend to play out much more for manufacturing, for construction, than they do for the service sector as a group. Manufacturing, construction, typically much more volatile. They'll see much bigger swings in terms of their output as we move through economic cycles. It's true here, it's true generally in economies. Services tend to be much steadier. They do have cycles, but they do tend to be, as a group, much smoother in terms of their profiles. That will not be the case this time. Services as a group will do as much, if not more, of the cyclical decline and then recovery as those other two more typically volatile sectors. And so that's going to be something that the economy is going to have to come to get to grips with, policymakers as well, something that economists we're going to be monitoring very closely. Just to finish up, so I want to make sure I give Nikki plenty of time to talk about the government stimulus packages and what they're going to do and what that looks like. Just a brief comment on the states, sort of trying to pull together everything I've just said thus far. So in terms of looking at the states from our work, we see that New South Wales and Victoria, we think, are the most vulnerable in the downturn. They're likely to see the biggest corrections in terms of output GSP over the near term. That really reflects that those two states, again, as Paul flagged, are very much more focused than others on the service sector. They're particularly focused on the services sectors that are going to get hit hardest, tourism and services related to that, higher education as well. And for New South Wales in particular, there's much less in terms of share of GSP, much less of an offset coming through from mining and agriculture. And again, that's also true for Victoria. Both states also were already grappling with a downturn in residential construction activity. I think Paul's right to flag that we were starting to see the signs that activity might be expected to pick up towards the end of this year. Dwelling approvals had sort of hit the trough in the first 3 months of this year. We're even showing some signs of improving in February and March. that trend is very likely to turn around. This is, again, not an environment where it's encouraging for developers to jump in and get projects off the ground, particularly given those longer term questions around migration and what that might look like, what the recovery looks like, how many of the students do come back, do we still get the same volume of inflows coming through? All of these are really crucial questions for residential construction activity and for student accommodation as well. And whilst we're still trying to see what the answers to those questions are, it's unlikely that projects are going to get off the ground. So we do think that there will be a second leg down in terms of dwelling approvals activity, and that's then going to put a further drag in terms of the construction sector. So a bit of a perfect storm, if you like, for New South Wales in particular, and also Victoria. On the other end of the spectrum of the bigger states, I won't talk too much about the smaller states and territories. Western Australia, in terms of GSP, largely reflecting that heavy focus on mining, the importance of mining in their output measure. But it is worth definitely keeping in mind with WA that mining is employment light, it's a relatively capital intensive sector, and the impact on employment in WA is going to be broadly in line with the rest of the country. They are everywhere. So what we're likely to see for WA is something of a disconnect between outputs from the state and, if you like, domestic demand, state final demand. They're absolutely going to experience a demand recession as the rest of the country is, but that will be hidden in their output numbers by that mining sector. That's not going to feel any more comfortable for the people that live and work in WA, that are particularly in the sectors that are exposed the most to this crisis. So it's going to be a bit of a disconnect when we get that data starting to feed through. So that's a sort of bit more of a deep dive, I hope, on the domestic economy. A few more details to flesh out the absolute near term, which is where I wanted to focus, and I'm sure we'll have some discussion of the medium and long term in the Q&A session. But for now, I'll hand over to Nikki to go through the government's response, what that looks like, and where we go from here in terms of policy.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, and hopefully I will get these controls working. So I've just got a couple of slides. What I wanted to talk to you about today, three things. So what actually has government, and that should be governments, been doing, because it's state as well as federal? Do I think it will work? And then how will we pay for it? So just having, I don't know, I'm just going to go, we'll just do it this way because my controls don't seem to be working that well. Okay, I don't know what's going on here. We might just... Okay, we've got it. So, love technology when it works, and don't when it doesn't. So what's been done so far? I'm not sure whether it was an ABC journalist or whether it's the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, but the word mind-boggling was what he talked about when he was talking about the current size of the federal fiscal package. And of course, that's actually 3 different packages in the main, with some additional support on the side that's been coming through. And I just think it's worthwhile talking through, what we're actually seeing and the scale of this, because just as we keep saying unprecedented in terms of the scale of the economic impacts, which you've just heard a lot from Paul and Sarah about, same can be said for the government response is on an unprecedented scale. But first and foremost, we need to keep coming back to the fact that this is a health crisis. And unfortunately, the remedy for the health crisis is inducing an economic crisis. Paul's quite right to say that this is a diabolical situation and choice for any government to make. And whilst you may think that the measures government has taken aren't perfect, they have done it enormously well to get the level of support out in the time that they have. And if we start up with the sort of top right-hand corner, thinking about health and civic measures, because this is where it all started, we have travel and movement restrictions. We have hopefully now starting to get increased testing and possibly track and trace. And if you think about that progression, travel and movement restrictions are what is causing, the economic gridlock. We're now starting to get to a stage where we are seeing increased testing because increased tests have become available, and that starts to open up the opportunity for there to be perhaps more movement. And additionally, the question is now being asked, and government is looking at the potential for people to opt in to measures that would allow you to track and trace where you've been and where you're in contact with others, which would allow us to have more freedom of movement. And everything ultimately comes down to not the economic measures, but actually these health measures that are in place, because nothing can happen and no recovery can take place until we start to get some sort of control over the health issue. It's amazing to think that it's less than a month since we had, or about a month since we had the very first package of 17 billion, and as much as or as little as 2 days before that package was announced, people were talking about, maybe it was going to be 8 or 10 billion, and 17 came out, and pretty quickly people were saying, well, that's amazing, but we're going to need more. And it wasn't long before we did need more, and we got 60 odd billion, and then 170 odd billion after 30 odd billion after that in the third package. We've also seen the financial system support in terms of a cash rate and quantitative easing that was mentioned before. In terms of what's specifically been done, and this goes to my second question, which is how will it work, or will it work? So at the household level, we've seen the introduction of Job Seeker, which is the replacement of New Start, but at a doubled level. The introduction of the Job Keeper, which is equivalent to $1,500 a fortnight, or $400 approximately more than the Job Seeker. Does anyone remember that there's two $750 cash payments still to come to low-income households? Of course, early access to super, reduction in the minimum drawdown for retirees, and rent relief that comes from the state governments. All of those things will help, but when we see, of course, we saw unemployment numbers come out this morning and rise from 5.1 to 5.2. If only that were true. The MEAS survey, of course, was done earlier in the month. I still think it actually is not measuring, because there were lots of shutdowns already happening particularly in the hospitality and tourism sectors in those first couple of weeks. So I think it's an understatement, and the 50,000 survey might not be enough. But we are seeing, obviously, we had thought that the unemployment rate would get to 17% at the peak. We now think it's probably closer to 12% because of that Job Keeper. But a lot depends on how long this goes on for. Now, on top of all those things, which will cushion households but won't protect them, and there are those that won't qualify for anything because they've potentially got a partner that works, and that's they will still be, even though they've got one partner with a reasonable income, if they don't get any support, they're going to have be exposed for rent, for mortgage. It's going to have massive consequences. There are a lot of people who are still attached to their workforces, working lower hours, or attached and working no hours. Significantly reduced income. So as mentioned before, that's going to have big flow-on effects. For businesses, I think there's a real question about how much works here. And there's a whole lot that's gone from both state and federal government, including payroll support, increases in credit thresholds, investment support, apprentice subsidies, that broader $1 billion program, which will take a bit longer, help for the airline industry, the fresh food exporters. So we're seeing payroll tax and fees and charges. There's a whole load of things that have been done at state and federal level. The biggest part of the package for businesses was originally around that accelerated depreciation and instant asset write-off. And, I think Sarah alluded to this, in this environment, we've already seen business confidence fall off a cliff. You're hardly likely, however much you can write it off, A, you don't have the cash flows against which to write things off, and B, it's not hardly the environment you're going to want to run out and spend unless you're in one of those very rare sectors that is doing well. And there are some, Sarah mentioned some of them, and we know, for example, from credit card data that people are spending more on food, also alcohol, and they're also spending more on household items. So Some of this is having a flow-through effect. I suspect that we're going to also need to see some additional industry support, and I think that's where the focus of future rounds of assistance will come, depending on the longevity of how long these restrictions are in place. But you can see from that slide and from just the things that I've pointed to, the quantum that we're talking about is absolutely enormous. Has gone in every possible direction that it can. I think there is, as I said, going to need to be more industry support. I think things like construction is in particular going to need to be if you just have a look here, this is a chart from the Bureau of Statistics. As Sarah mentioned, they're putting out a lot more data more frequently now to help us understand. And you can see from this that in the chart on the right, the chart on the left, we won't worry too much about. That's sort of what people have been doing in response by employee size. But one of the things I think is interesting is what's the sectors that have been hit hardest first. And you'll see that those four big sectors, professional services, construction, the real estate, and broadly professional services, financial as well, have had impacts anywhere between sort of 4% and 7% of businesses shut down. But it's really in those smaller sectors in terms of tourism, arts and rec, retail, where we're seeing the very big first round impacts. So it's clear that despite the fact that the government has put a lot of money on the line, or I should say governments have put a lot of money on the line, it's still quite clear that this is not a panacea. There is no silver bullet. You can give people money to spend, but if they can't actually go out and spend it, the amount that they are willing to increase their spending on, whether they're doing a bit more household maintenance, which seems to be the case, or they're spending it a bit more on food hoarding, there comes a point at which you stop that. Perhaps people are drinking more wine than they should be, but by and large, there comes a point at which the hoarding will have to stop, and that will come back a bit as well. So you can't mitigate against absolutely everything that this shock is bringing upon us. And we have to keep coming back to the fact that this is not a standard, economic shutdown or economic downturn. It's not like things that we have had in the past where the economy's run too fast. We've had to jack up interest rates. The economy then over-responds, or we have an asset price bubble, and things start to downturn, and you respond quickly with monetary and fiscal policy. This, by its very nature, you cannot fully mitigate against, because you're actually telling people you can't work, you can't spend. So until we get to the point where we can deal with the health crisis and we can get back out there, we are going to always have to, you can help households, you can help businesses, but you will be cushioning the blow. You will not be stopping it by any means. So it comes on to my final chart, which is, we've got a big amount of support. It's fantastically how quickly it's been out there. It's aiming at all the right areas. We'll probably need more. It's still not going to do everything we need it to, but nothing could. It's not because it's poorly designed policy. It's because no policy is going to deal with the restrictions that we've got. So then we're asking the question now, how on earth are we going to pay for this? So the estimates are stacking up. We're talking about, costs in around 10% of GDP. So increasing our national debt by that amount. That's just the expenditure side. We've then got the revenue side, of course, because personal and business revenues, all sorts of revenues will be severely reduced. So we could be looking at getting to debt to GDP of maybe 50%. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually not when you think about it. So globally, average is around 80%. We know that when you get to 90 to 100%, that's where it starts to impact your long-term potential growth rates. But this is something that Australia can pay for over the long term. I just wanted to quickly throw in, I'm reading a lot more about modern monetary theory, which I've called magical monetary theory. This is the idea that you can actually keep building up debt forever, and it actually doesn't matter, because as long as interest rates stay below the level of growth, your economy grows faster, and therefore you're as a percent of your economy, you're not adding to debt. that if all you have to do is look at Argentina to know that that is not the case, that once you get a crisis of confidence in a country, very quickly things go awry, and that we can't, it may not be the same as a household debt, that, you know, the country won't be repossessed, but we do start to lose people, other countries that, and bond buyers do start to lose confidence, and therefore, you know, it is not a solution, unfortunately. I just thought I'd throw that in there because I seem to be hearing and reading about it increasingly. There's a lot of debate amongst the more nerdish economists on what this is. But so it does matter that we have debt. We will have to pay for it. But our current estimates are that we're talking about an increase if all of these programs got taken up, and they won't all be taken up because they won't all be, businesses and individuals won't necessarily qualify or want to have the particular support that's available to them. We think it could be as much as around $1.5 billion of extra interest alone. Now, to pay for that, you could increase your Medicare levy from 2% to 2.1%. That's not a big deal. Then paying off the rest of the debt, of course we will have to do it. But I would ask millennials to settle down a little bit, not worry too much about your future. Part of that debt will be paid off by the fact that as the economy recovers, we get stronger growth and then stronger revenues. There will be some tough decisions over time, but if governments are sensible and take a moderate approach, if we turn away from or shy away from the budget or debt emergencies and crises for a AAA rated country, I think we can do that. Then we have time to repay that debt in a measured way that will not affect the, you know, longer term economic, productive, social and environmental outcomes that we all want to achieve as we go through, you know, go through the decades. So the future of budgets might look a little bit different, but it, you know, it shouldn't have to be about crisis management in the short term. It should be about sensible management, measured management over the long term. Thanks, and I'll hand back to you, Jared.
Thank you all for those presentations. Pretty sobering, but plenty to think about on the back of that. And it seems like people have gone wild on Pigeonhole in terms of asking questions. Despite that, I'll still encourage people to get on there and vote for their favourite questions or to ask others using the link. I might start with an anonymous question that's come in and direct it your way, Paul. This issue around disruption to global supply chains, which seems to be in the commentary every day. Interested in your perspective on how big this actually is in terms of the level of disruption we're seeing globally in supply chains first, but then also, you know, when you talk about how things might be different on the other side, do you see any evidence that we actually will be different in terms of our manufacturing base in Australia, given some of the calls around things like medical devices and other kind of essentials that have come out of this crisis?
So I think there are a range of different issues here. I mean, the first one is, even before COVID-19, we were moving towards a world where there was more nationalism. Countries were looking to protect their economies a bit more. I mean, this was partly led by the US and China trade negotiations that were going on, and the trade tensions that were rising. So that trend was already there to some degree. I think this event has brought out some more of that sort of rhetoric and that sort of move in terms of what countries are seeking to do. I don't think there are clear signs as yet that there really has been a really large negative sort of supply displacement, permanent supply displacement. Obviously, with China shutting down for a period of time, the first sort of couple of months of the year, and then bouncing, or first of February in particular, that had disruptive effects. But China is now on some sort of bounce back. I mean, their industrial production's picking up again. So that's, you know, worth keeping that in mind. I think companies will reassess their just-in-time inventory systems. They'll look at how much inventory they're carrying around. Are they carrying enough to meet demand when these sorts of events or risks come along? And obviously there's a short-term cost of being less profitable because you carry around more inventory, but you're protecting yourself in the sense that you're having more insurance. In terms of the idea of moving more manufacturing back to Australia as a consequence of seeing that obviously we're highly reliant on what's happening offshore, I would caution against this. I think this is an area where we should learn lessons from the past, and that is anytime we've tried to actively move policy to make sure manufacturing moves back to Australia, it hasn't been particularly successful. Sure, there may be very specific examples where it would be helpful if we were carrying around more particular medical technology or more ventilators or these sorts of things, and we need to look at health policy in that regard. But I don't think that this should be a wide sweeping excuse for saying, well, actually, we need to move more manufacturing back to Australia. We can't possibly manufacture everything. It wouldn't make any sense. One of the major reasons why we've done so well in recent years is because we're an open economy that's really used the competition that's come from imports to make our economy more productive. And so those are the lessons we need to keep in mind. We need to remember those lessons when we're thinking about designing policy post-COVID-19.
Thanks, Paul. And I think, there's recently an interview with, I think, one of the people who's leading some of the ventilator manufacturing here in Australia. And the number one impediment that they described in terms of their business is actually investment, and just connecting the dots on Sarah's comments around business investment. It doesn't seem like that is going to be there to support those industries in any case. We have another question, a question here from Kirsty O'Connell, which I might direct your way, Sarah. She's quite rightly saying we're not hearing a lot about how the COVID crisis might impact funding and delivery of Australia's current $230 billion infrastructure pipeline, or the role that infrastructure will play in recovery. Particularly given your comments around construction and impacts on housing markets. What do you think about what role infrastructure might play domestically?
Yeah, and I think this may cross over a little bit with Nikki's comments on policy, because obviously this is as much a policy decision as it is a private sector decision to invest in industries which are heavily infrastructure based. But in terms of the infrastructure pipeline, and particularly the public piece of that, we may well see some delays in terms of work done to loop back to the supply chain discussion we were just having. So if we do start to see reports, and if we start to see on the ground that there's a struggle to get hold of the materials that are needed, potentially also some of the labour force that's needed as well, given those travel restrictions, then it's possible that we'll see some delays. But I wouldn't expect, in terms of public infrastructure projects that have been announced, for any of those to be pulled. In fact, I actually think we're going to see the opposite. We'll see as we move through into the recovery phase. So once we do get to a point where, from a public health perspective, it's possible to relax the social distancing rules and the restrictions we're currently working under, and that we can get going again, at least to some extent, we'll see a more traditional, if you like, government stimulus package, which does focus on giving the economy a shot in the arm in terms of demand. And one of the facets of that is government investments. That can be infrastructure investment. It can be other types of capital investment as well. Some non-residential building construction activity, perhaps around schools, maybe hospitals, other parts of government spending too, more generally. But in terms of specifically infrastructure, I think we're likely to see and at least a push from the government to accelerate some of the current projects and maybe introduce some new ones and bring some of the ones that perhaps are scheduled for later, bring them forward in the pipeline. So really as much activity as we possibly can. So there may well be some disruptions, I said, from the supply chain channels and from the labour supply side as well, possibly. But in terms of the desire, if you like, or the policy imperative, I think that it will be acceleration, if it's going to be anything relative to where we were pre-crisis.
Might just let people know, based on the demand for questions, we are probably going to go over a little bit. So I hope none of our speakers have got pressing things in the next 10 minutes, but we will go over to try and answer some of these questions that we're getting through. Nikki, I saw you nodding your head just then. Did you want to weigh in on the issue of infrastructure and what role that may play in terms of the response?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question, and it's also a great opportunity for government to use a crisis to solve some problems. So we know, for example, that New South Wales government has already announced that they're going to bring forward some maintenance and capex around public infrastructure, so as a way to stimulate the economy. But if we think about, some of the damage to bushfire communities, and notwithstanding, there are travel restrictions, we know that, some of the bushfire cleanup that's being done, the company that's managing that has been actually quite good at focusing, using local engagement as far as possible. So being able to use this time to support the economy, to support additional investment in things like cleanup from bushfires, but also in new green infrastructure, planning for that. There's lots of bits that can be done along the way. There's obviously a lot of planning that needs to be done before things are shovel ready. So there's no reason why that couldn't be got underway. Similarly, with construction, if we're going to have a fall off, as we all expect in private sector housing, then one of the greatest issues that our country has faced, before COVID and aside from climate change, is around housing affordability and affordable housing. So, being able to commission or fast track some social housing, a lot of which is shovel ready, would be a great way of seeing, us provide stimulus that actually has a really good outcome. And we know this government particularly is very focused on making sure that any investment decisions or any stimulus decisions it makes are ones that will be, judged well down the track. And so those are all things that, there are lots of areas and issues to be addressed where they could direct that stimulus to address some very pressing problems through the likes of, social infrastructure, green infrastructure, as well as the more regular, transport and other economic infrastructure.
Thanks, Nikki. We've got another question here around insights on the economic implications of COVID-19 for regional Australia and which regions will be disproportionately impacted compared to metro areas and vice versa. Sarah, you mentioned some of the state-based differences. Are you seeing anything in terms of regions you think might potentially be hit the hardest?
Yeah, it's definitely very early days for us getting some hard data on that. But in general, we do think that the metro areas, so the capital cities, the greater capital city regions, are likely to see more of a hit in terms of activity relative to the regions within any given state. That really reflects the makeup of activity in the regions versus the metros, and the metros tend to be disproportionately more focused on services, and it's services that are taking the brunt. Having said that, clearly, particularly with domestic travel restrictions being what they are for a number of regional communities, this is a very, very challenging time for them. Nikki mentioned the bushfires. That is a substantial double hit. In fact, there were reports just out today of regions that have been starting to see a return of visitors in February after the damage and the disruption that took place in January. And then, of course, that's been choked off completely now because we're not allowed to travel. We all have to stay at home. So for some of the regions that are particularly tourism focused and visitor focused, for them, this is going to be very, very challenging until we can move around internally, at least. I suppose in terms of thinking about the unwinding of the restrictions and how that's likely to proceed, it's certainly, we obviously don't know any of the details yet, but it does look very likely that some of the last restrictions to be removed will be around international travel. But the domestic travel could possibly be opened up much sooner than that if we can get to a stage where the state governments are comfortable that moving people across state boundaries is not going to result in the community transfer and transmission being spread around the country. Then we could see domestic travel being opened up much sooner than international. And if that then means that there's many more visitors to these parts of the country because people want to take a holiday but they can't go abroad, so they choose to stay at home and go domestically, then there could potentially be some upside there relative to what these communities might otherwise have expected. But clearly that's down the track. That is not right now. So it is a bit more disparate across the regions, does very much depend on the focus of the area and what their key sectors are. But if we're looking more medium term, then there is, particularly for some of these regional tourism hotspots, potentially some upside, but we're not there yet.
Thanks for that, Sarah. And we're gonna jump straight across to more international matters, and I'll get you to weigh in here, Paul. A question from Tom Steinfort. Chinese productivity, key to Australian recovery, but how much does China's recovery hinge on demand from the Western world? China is one side of the equation.
It's a really important question. And I mean, so as I said, China has, had a hard hit, and then it is in some sort of recovery at this stage, but it's really yet to face the very large shock or the very large negative trade shock that's going to come from the Western economies now going into deep downturns. And so that is something that China needs to manage. Now, the key for us, I think, is, in order to manage that, China's going to need to deliver more support for its own domestic economy. It's going to need to use its policy levers to do that. And Australia tends to be tied into the Chinese domestic story, not into the not into the traded supply chain, we don't export a whole bunch of things that go into China's manufactured exports to the West. We export a lot of commodities that go into China's domestic demand. So if China pulls more levers to support its domestic demand, it still should be somewhat supportive for Australia. In fact, the more they have to pull those levers, the more support Australia is likely to get. This doesn't make it necessarily easy for China. That's not what I'm saying. I think China's it's going to have a hard time as well. It's had a health crisis. It's having a bounce back, and then into the second half, it's going to have to deal with the negative trade shock. But when you think about it from Australia's perspective, the fact that China has got more levers to pull, it's going to be reorienting its growth to domestic is somewhat helpful for Australia.
Okay, Nikki, you mentioned kind of the inevitability of continuing industry support, given what we're seeing and what we've seen on news reports in recent days. Scott, with the topic heading potential bailouts, has asked about the issue between protecting competition versus introducing moral hazard and systemic risk. How can the government preserve the right incentives for business and break this dilemma? And certainly we've seen some of those questions being asked around the aviation industry.
Yeah.
What's your view on that for the government?
Yeah, it's played out very clearly with the airlines, where there is a clear national interest in ensuring that we have one national airline. There is a degree of national interest in ensuring that we have competition in that sector. But in terms of limited resources from the government, and making sure that if they are going to bail out, for want of a better word, a corporation, they want to bail out one that is, financially robust under normal circumstances. It becomes a question, though, also, I think, that governments need to ask, is this a question of bailout, or is it a question of potential nationalisation for a period of time? There's a quote going around at the moment, in times of war, and we are fighting an unseen enemy, I guess, we're all socialists. And we might need to think about things a little bit differently as to, what is in the national interest in terms of which companies we preserve. I mean, Sarah talked a little bit before about, what the interest of the country might be in supporting certain types of manufacturing sectors. We've seen this in the past. We've seen, and this is what the Button Plan and subsequent movements to reduce tariffs, to make sure that we don't artificially prop up sectors, because we know this is just economics 101 from Adam Smith's day, that you don't prop up inefficient sectors. If, however, you have, and nor do we pick winners, but if, however, you have an induced crisis where a sector, through no fault of its own, faces, economic disaster, or for want of a better word, we have to look at what are the options. And it's not just necessarily handing over money. I think there will inevitably be, with some of the business assistance programs that have already been approved, there will be those that don't necessarily use them in the best possible way. But you have to go forward with, we make policy on the basis that most people behave reasonably and rationally. When it comes, though, to large amounts of money, the government will have to take into account, a cost-benefit analysis, which is not just, that benefit side of it is not just keeping jobs going in a particular sector, but it's about what does the economy need. And clearly we need food security, we need energy security, we need to have a national airline. So for some sectors, if they cannot weather this storm, there will need to be some sort of bailout, and it needs to be thought through as to, ultimately what is the best outcome for the taxpayer, as well as the sector.
Well, thank you for that. I think I've been given the roll up. Maybe very quickly go to each of you and start with Paul's proposition that there are going to be some things that are very different on the other side of this. And I'm just wondering if each of you could give kind of a quick snapshot of the one thing that you think could be the most profound kind of difference to the economy on the other side of this crisis.
I think the most likely, the thing that's going to be most profound for Australia is that I think it's going to take quite some time before people movement across the international border, i.e. people coming from overseas to Australia, will look anything like what we've seen in the recent past. I think it's going to look quite different for quite some time. It could be quite different for a really long time. And that affects, and you've got to think about it this way, tourism, education, exports. It affects international commerce to a degree, but probably most critically for Australia, it's how it affects migration. That's going to be really a critical feature of how to think about where the growth's going to come from, and areas like the housing market and like demand for consumer goods. And a lot of what's driven Australia's growth in recent years has been strong population growth driven by migration. So that is one of the key questions in my mind as to how that's going to play out. And you've got to watch that very carefully, because that migration story has been a key support for Australia's growth in recent years. It may be less of a support, for a while. Certainly in the short run, it is. I mean, fundamentally, it just is. The borders are closed right now. But it may be a while before it's actually back to anything like what we've seen, and that's going to have broad-ranging implications.
Thanks, Paul. Sarah?
I think I do agree with Paul. I think that migration story and quite what that looks like over the next 2 or 3 years is pretty crucial. But I think sort of to go with that slightly, but from a different tangent, what the labour market ends up looking like. How big a dislocation are we talking about in terms of jobs lost? How do they materialise over time? Some of the supports that have been put in place are going to, for want of a better word, hide some of that unemployment in the near term, because people are going to stay formally employed, but they won't necessarily be working and producing in the same way. And do those jobs eventually disappear? And how does the economy pivot and restructure to reabsorb that extra labour? We know that it takes a long time for labour markets to fully recover from shocks. We've seen that experience here over the decades since the financial crisis, and the long, slow process it took for the unemployment rate to come back down. What that looks like then over the medium, long term, how that adjustment process works, and how we utilise people productively and to the best of their ability and the best of the economy's ability to optimise the outcome, to stimulate growth and economic development over time. That I think is going to be pretty crucial, and one to certainly look at and watch and see how it evolves. But very much a medium-term issue. That's not something we're going to see much of in terms of how it plays out in the next 6 months. And
finally, Nikki.
Well, I'll try and leave people with a bit more optimistic note. I think one of the lessons we're learning is how to be more sustainable. I think we're also understanding the potential shocks from climate change in the future and disruption that can cause, and the need for action on that front. And I think if we can learn to live more sustainable lives, to commute less, to spend less, and basically think more about our impact on the environment as a result of what's been imposed on us at the moment, then it won't be a complete disaster. We will come out of this with some lessons learned about how to live better lives, to have better economic outcomes that also embrace better social and environmental outcomes as well.
Thank you, Nikki. You're meeting my KPI for all my podcasts and things, which is to try and end on a positive note. So, and I didn't even tell you to do that. So that's a great note to end on. I really want to thank the participants for agreeing to speak on these matters and going over time. We really do appreciate it, and the revised format of live stream, which can be interesting. Absolutely want to thank our event sponsors, HSBC, once again for their support for this event, and I think it's been a fantastic, insightful discussion. Viewers can post additional questions to Pigeonhole. I think there's some that we didn't get to. That remains open for a little while longer, so we'll try and answer those questions in our post-event email. The email will also include a link to the recording so that you can share that with others. So really, I think that, I hope all of our viewers today have found this informative and interesting, particularly in terms of the implications for their sectors and how they conduct their business over the coming months and years. We'll continue to hold these sorts of discussions. CEDA, as I said, very important platform for discussion on economic and social development and taking those longer term views on issues. Please keep an eye on our website, our social media, for future live streams, podcasts, blogs, all of those sorts of things. I do want to thank everyone for joining us and encourage you until next time to please stay safe, and I hope everyone's well out there. Thank you very much.